Again, I appreciate the invitation to be here. As was mentioned, I'm a dairy nutritionist, okay? So I'd like you to take all the information I'm sharing with you today and be careful with that and try to adapt to how you handle your operations, okay? Everything that we're going to show today is a little bit of what we've been working in the last 5 to 6 years, okay? There is a lot of new information and hopefully can be of some good use to you, okay? The way we entitled this presentation is Key Steps to Improve the Nutritive Value of Corn Silage, and hopefully by the end of this presentation you should be able to do that, okay? However, in order to discuss nutritive value of corn silage, we are forced to visit specific ways we rank quality of corn silage, okay? Or specific measurements we use in order to evaluate the specific nutritive value of each silage, okay? So when you go to this first column here, we have a lot of different parameters that we can measure related to corn silage. And right next to it, we have arrows indicated how can we improve quality. Obviously, if the arrows are pointing down, it means that the lower those values are, the better. The higher those arrows are, for those pointing to the top, better those values are, okay? It's a very simple concept. We'll discuss that in more details in the next couple of slides. And after that, we'll try to introduce to you the strategies to change those measurements. Okay? So the first 5 rows here, they are all related to the same thing, okay? To the stover portion of the plant, okay? On that regard, we have concentration of NDF, lignin and digestible NDF, okay? Lignin and undigested NDF, in my mind as a dairy nutritionist, is exactly the same thing. Basically talks about the indigestible portion of the fiber, okay? After that, we have 2 different measurements of fiber digestibility. NDFD at 30 hours is an in vitro method. A lot of different people use the method. After that, we have the total tract NDF digestibility assay. It's a new assay. There are some commercial laboratories that start using those. Basically, they measure different time points of in vitro digestibility of NDF and estimate total tract NDF digestibility. Regardless of which one you want to use, you can improve your corn silage based on those values, okay? I'd like to highlight to you that regardless of which those methods you use, those numbers will only be used to rank feed stuff, okay? Those numbers, it will very unlikely be exactly the number the animals will digest them, okay? After that, we have 2 other indicators. One is the starch, okay? Starch concentration of corn silage. Obviously, we want to have more starch because the starch provides more energy than fiber, but there are much more than that, and hopefully I will convince you of that throughout this presentation. And the last one is the milk per ton metric. This is a metric that's widely used primarily in university hybrid trials, okay? Normally we use this particular assay to estimate milk production of a dairy cow per ton of corn silage you could feed, okay? It's a very good metric. It's not perfect, I won't lie to you, but I think there is a lot of value when you look to those numbers from university hybrid trials, okay? So all the time I'm evaluating the NDF-related indicators, normally what I try to understand is what this can do to the rumen of a dairy cow, okay? Excessive levels of NDF or excessive levels of indigestible NDF or lignin, if you will, it will limit consumption, okay? Consumption of dry matter will be reduced. The more NDF, the more lignin, the more undigested NDF you provided in the diet, okay? And this often impacts milk production, but more important than that, it impacts how we can establish the use of high forage diets. I know that for most of you, this may not be a concept you are looking for, to use very high forage diet, but for the dairy industry, it's very important because high forage makes the diet much cheaper, okay? But you need to make sure cows consume enough in order to do that. When we discuss the other side of the plant related to starch or starch digestibility, if you will, and in this case I highlighted prolamine here, okay? Prolamine is not starch, but it's a protein that is associated with starch, okay? This protein surrounds the starch, and it's one of the things that inhibits starch digestion in the rumen or starch digestion in the intestine, okay? So the more starch and starch D, in my opinion, the better. The more prolamine you have, in my opinion, the worse, okay? But the benefit of playing with those indicators is that you can alter energy density of the corn silage, and from there, you can have benefits in milk yield and feed efficiency. Hopefully, in your case, you can have benefits with feed efficiency and average daily gain, okay? I promise that this is the only slide that will discuss hybrids today, okay? Even though I enjoy working with different hybrids and I have my own opinions about them. I mentioned that milk per ton is a very good indicator, okay? However, I would like to highlight to you that when you choose a specific corn hybrid for your farm, you need to pay attention to another detail, okay? You see that it is in a specific graph. I have the milk per ton estimate in the y-axis here, but we also have yield of dry matter in tons per acre on the x-axis. The objective is a combination of both. You want to make sure you have a corn hybrid that produces a lot, but with very good quality, okay? This is exactly the same graph I used for the University of Florida hybrid trials in order to show producers some of the results we have when seed companies add their hybrids to our trials. And what I try to tell them is you want to look for hybrids that are in this corner here. What I mean with that is you want to look for hybrids that produce a lot per ton, but produce very well per acre, okay? Okay, so now that we put those indicators aside, I will try to describe to you some strategies that can help you to improve those indicators. Okay. So when you think about the whole plant corn silage, we often divide that, at least from a research setting, into two different fractions, okay? One is the yellow fraction here, the kernels, and the other fraction is highlighted in green here, is the stover fraction, okay? I often work with those fractions separately in a research environment. But the issue is, can you harvest them separately and feed them together later? You cannot, right? So obviously there are things that affect one side that may affect negatively the other side, so you need to pay attention to those, okay? Today, we'll try to describe a little bit of each, separate, just to give you a background on how to improve those fractions, okay? So from the kernel side of the equation here, we are often discussing starch, right? So my objective here is to increase the starch digestibility. So some years ago, we went to literature with corn silage-based diets offered to dairy cows, and we saw that there is a variance in starch digestibility by lactating animals from 80 to 100%. So there is a huge gap there that we can improve, okay? If it's easy to improve, it's a different scenario, but there is a huge gap there, okay? Right under those values, you see that we have a list of factors that perhaps we could use to improve digestibility of starch. In my opinion, that's exactly the order of importance on how to improve digestibility of starch, okay? The first one will be kernel particle size, okay? That's the topic we'll cover the most today. The reason why I'm saying that is if you do not break kernels, starch will not be used by bacteria in the rumen, will not be degraded by enzymes in the intestine, will not become energy for the animal, okay? After that, we have a brand new topic that's duration of silage fermentation, okay? I think this topic is fairly recent, it's about 5 to 6 years old, okay? And basically, what we learned from that is if you have the option to store corn silage for longer periods, there are bacteria that are inside the silo that can produce proteases that will break down the prolamine protein I mentioned a couple slides ago and make starch more available, okay? Perhaps we could try to use this as a strategies to start feeding less digestible material later and the more digestible material first, because maybe they will reach similar levels of digestibility. After that, we can discuss a little bit of kernel maturity. Okay? That's the natural physiology of the plant. Okay? The corn plant, as it matures, kernel gets harder and harder, consequently it's harder to break, right? In addition to that, as the kernel matures, there is accumulation of that prolamine protein I mentioned, makes the starch harder to be digested. Okay? After that, we have two topics that are slightly more difficult to apply in the field. Okay? One of those is endosperm properties. Okay? By endosperm property, I mean different types of hybrids. Okay? Theoretically, there are hybrids that are more digestible than others. Okay? But there are several other things that affect that. Okay? Perhaps you could find some good hybrids in the region you are. Okay? However, you need to make sure you see data from several years, different locations, to choose those hybrids appropriately. And that's the only comment I'll make about that today. Okay? The last topic here is additives. I'm not talking about additives you add to the diet. I'm discussing additives you could add directly to corn silage in order to try to improve digestibility of starch. I will not lie to you. There is nothing in the market that does that. Okay? At least there is nothing in the market that we know that in 100% of the cases it does that. The only thing we tested over and over that was very effective is addition of exogenous proteases. Guess what? It's not in the market. Okay? So you cannot use it. Okay? I'm not discussing additives you add to the diet. Perhaps there are good additives you could add to the diet and change this pattern. Okay? But you add directly to corn silage, adding silane in order to obtain that, there is nothing. Okay? When we move to the other side of the equation, the fiber portion, normally we are discussing NDF digestibility. And here I highlighted the variance in vitro NDF digestibility that we found in corn silage. Okay? I run now for 2 years the University of Florida hybrid trials. There we have two crops, the spring and the summer crop, and that's exactly the variance we have from all the hybrids and from both seasons we have there. It's a lot of variance. Okay? If I change some of the management practice I have, it also influences those numbers. Okay? The main factor that contributes to that is the ratio between lignin and NDF. In other words, the more lignin you have in a plant, less digestible the fiber portion will be. These are some of the factors that could affect that. Not the only factors, but some of them. One would be hybrid type. There are hybrids in the market that have lower levels of lignin and could be used in order to generate greater intake by animals and consequently greater production. Besides, there is a maturity factor. This is probably less pronounced in the fiber than in the starch, in my opinion. However, as plants mature, they tend to accumulate more lignin. With the accumulation of more lignin, they become less digestible. And the last thing I want to cover related to fiber in this slide is the use of additives. Well, I won't lie to you. There are additives in the market, okay, that can influence fiber digestibility of silage. However, it is my opinion that research trials have a lot of variance in that regard, or in how effective those additives are. So my suggestion to you is try to use additives that you saw that work in your area with the type of hybrids you commonly use. Okay, so now I will do my best in the next 5 or so minutes to convince you that you need to break kernels. Okay? So I'd like to first introduce to you about the corn kernel. Okay? In my opinion, one of the most important parts of the corn silage. The issue related to the corn kernel is that's exactly the same thing you use when you plant corn, right? So it is a seed. So this particular feedstuff here was designed by nature to be a new plant, not to be a feedstuff. Okay? So when you open that kernel in the middle, you'll see that you have a white portion. Okay? That's the endosperm. That's where starch is. Okay? You have here the embryo, okay, the germ. That's what's going to be a new plant. and you have an outside portion protecting everything that is inside that we call pericarp. It's very hard, okay? If you throw an intact kernel into the rumen of a dairy cow or a beef cow, it's not going to be digested because the pericarp inhibits digestion very well, okay? Of course, there are exceptions to this rule, okay? But this is the reality. So said that, if there is a lot of protection, the first thing you need to do is to eliminate this protection. The way to do that, by breaking more kernels. Okay? So in order to prove this concept to you, some years ago, during the time I was in grad school, we had an army of interns, okay? And please don't give me credit for doing that because I didn't do anything other than summarize the data. So we collected samples from 300 hybrids that we had in storage from previous trials, all harvested at corn silage maturity, but not fermented like corn silage is, okay? So what our interns did during that time is they grabbed 3 kernels from each hybrid and put in a pool to generate all those particle size. And then they got a scalpel and they cut by hand from 2 to 64 pieces, okay? If you think this is an easy thing to do, I would love to have you in my lab trying to do that, okay? It takes a lot of time. It was very hard, but was very effective. For the record, we want to stop in 32 pieces and they wanted to go to 64. We let them do that, but we didn't want to, okay? But you can see that there is a huge difference in particle size when you go from 2 to 64, right? Very likely, this is the difference you find in kernels when you harvest corn silage. So what we did is we put some of those pieces into Encom bags, and then we put inside the rumen of a dairy cow, okay? We run a simple ruminal in situ assay, and we allow those bags to stay in the rumen from 3 to 24 hours to see how digestible those kernels are, okay? Again, before I discuss digestibility, those are unfermented kernels. Very likely the difference that you will find is slightly lower than the difference we found if you use fermented material, but would be very hard to cut in silo and then after that run the trial, okay? So you can see with the blue line here in the bottom that when you add a whole kernel, and yes, we did that out of curiosity, okay, we didn't use only those that we cut, digestibility is minimal, okay? It's very, very low. What does that tell us is if you don't process well, a lot of the starch that is in that kernel is going to live in the manure, okay? Obviously, the more you break the kernels, greater the extent of digestion gets, okay? So I think this is a real illustration on how important it is to break kernels, but more important than that, how important it is to break a lot of kernels, okay? So in order to do that, there is only one way. You need to do adequate and constant. Here's the most important word in this sentence, constant monitoring, okay? You need to be there. You need to look how the silage is being processed during harvest, okay? Oh, I have a very good guy. He's chopping everything for me. I believe that there are a lot of very good people in the field, but you need to be there to make sure everything went well because how many times a year do you harvest corn silage? 1? Anybody harvest 2 times? Very few, probably none. So if you don't harvest properly this time, you have 1 year to prepare yourself again. But that feed stuff will remain the same, okay? So I'll show you a very simple way of doing that. That's my favorite way. It's time consuming, okay? But it is worth, okay? This is an adapted method that researchers from University of Wisconsin put together. So if you collect a sample at harvesting, you just need a bucket with water, okay? A 5-gallon bucket, very simple. You throw a handful sample into the water. You agitate slowly. You don't need to agitate for more than a minute, okay? There is a difference in density between fiber and kernels. So fiber will float, kernels will sink. Consequently, you can easily remove the fiber portion, pour the water out, and see the kernels. I'll tell you, it's much easier to see processing looking only to the kernels than looking to the whole samples. A lot of time when you look to the whole sample, silage looks amazing. But when you pass through the water and look to all the grains that are there, it does not, okay? Here's just a representation of a very poorly and a very properly processed silage, okay? I'm a radical in that regard, okay? So if you ask me, I will tell you should not have any unbroken kernel in your silage. But that's me, okay? You need to develop your own guidelines and adjust from there. So I'm not gonna tell you exactly how many unbroken kernels you need to have, okay? So that's my first take-home message for you. Break more kernels. It's a very simple message, and I hope what we show you today was effective to provide that, okay? The second thing I want to discuss is maturity at harvest, okay? A lot of times, we need to keep plants in the field for longer to accumulate more starch. A lot of times, we want to leave plants in the field for longer to accumulate more dry matter. So our yields are slightly greater, okay? However, many years ago, were highlighted some potential issues about harvesting silage above 40% dry matter. Some of those issues include poor packing, which may lead to more yeast and molds in the silage, okay? Higher risk of shrinkage and mycotoxins, but more important than that, as I mentioned earlier, lower starch and lower fiber digestibility. However, you know that there is a lot of technologies that keep improving in the field. For example, seed companies work every single day to put in the market new hybrids. And let's be honest, they're doing a good job, right? There are recent hybrids that are way better than hybrids we used to use 20 years ago, okay? Not that I used to plant corn 20 years ago, but that's the reality, okay? So one question we always have is, modern hybrids do not have issues on fiber digestibility, or those issues remain? And obviously, are those issues the same as before, or they improve? Okay? There are several other technologies available, okay? More aggressive processors, for example. Okay? Do those technologies help to minimize the issue with maturity? Or those modern hybrids, do they have less issues with kernel hardness? Okay? And the last, and this one I can tell you I really tested, ensiling time may overcome those differences in starch digestibility. By ensiling time, I mean the duration that you left silage inside of the silo fermenting prior to feeding, okay? As I mentioned earlier, this particular technique increases starch digestibility, and I have a graph here to show that later, okay? It could be an option, okay? Well, some years ago, one of my colleagues at University of Florida, Dr. Adezogan, he planted 18 hybrids during the summer in Florida, and he collected from maturities ranging from 30 to 45% dry matter. I'm not recommending 45% dry matter. I doubt any crop consultant would recommend 45 dry matter. We just use that in order to understand the process, okay? So when you evaluate what happens with those plants, obviously you have some variance in NDF and an increase in starch. The increase in starch was expected, right? That's part of the reason why we wanted to do that. However, when you look to fiber digestibility of the plant, there is a slow decrease, okay? This is 1 to 2 percentage units. It's a very small number, okay? May not translate into a huge response to the animal, but this is something to think about, okay? This is one trial, and this is the average across several hybrids. There are hybrids that the difference is between 6 and 7 percentage units. That's a lot. Okay. Obviously, yield of dry matter was greater for the 45% corn silage. We expected that. But when we measure milk per ton, here's in kilograms, but you have a decrease, okay? As silage maturity increase, silage quality decrease, milk production with that particular silage material is reduced, okay? I'd like to highlight that to you. I also like to highlight to you that there is no difference in milk per area, okay? Because the yields were greater in this end, okay? So you need to determine what is best for your area, for your farm, for what you want to do in terms of management, okay? With regard to kernel hardness, we highlighted the very few available corn silage trials evaluating kernel hardness. You can see that for most trials, kernel hardness or in this case highlighted as kernel vitreousness, which is very highly correlated with kernel hardness, it increases as kernel maturity increase. Okay? Is that true for every single hybrid you have in the market? Probably not. Okay, there are probably hybrids that are better, but those that we know that were tested, it's true. Okay? How about technologies, right? How about using very aggressive processors? That's a compile of literature. You can see that here in the bottom we have dry matter, content of whole plant corn silage. Here we have total track start digestibility. So this is digestibility measured in the cow that consume corn silage, based diets. And we have processed and unprocessed silage. Okay? You can see that if you harvest silage very early, you can have very high levels of start digestibility because it's very easy to break kernels. As you reach 32 to 40% dry matter, you see that the processor does a much better job in achieving greater start digestibility because it breaks more kernels. But look what happens when you reach above 40% dry matter. They don't really break all the kernels. You have more issues with that. Is that true for every field? Possibly not, okay? But there is potential that this will happen. So my second take-home message to you is maturity plays a major role in corn silage quality and digestibility. Modern hybrids, they are probably still susceptible to these effects, even though I believe it's to a smaller extent than it used to be. So what I normally suggest is, because dry matter content varies within and among fields, if you target between 33 and 35% dry matter, you will not exceed 40% dry matter, and you may end up with a very good crop. Okay? So that's what I normally suggest. Okay? Before we go to the final topic, I just would like to give you some harvesting guidelines I normally use. Okay? And you can see that there is a difference related to dry matter if you use or do not use a processor in your harvester. If you use a processor, I normally suggest 33 to 38% dry matter, which gives us our average of 35. But if you don't use processor, you need to go a little bit lower. You also need to be more aggressive with theoretical length of cut if you don't use processor. Okay? This is just some guidelines I use. You need to adjust for your own farm. Okay? Perhaps those numbers will not work everywhere. Okay? The last topic I have for you is about corn silage fermentation and its potential to increase start digestibility. This is a summary of all the research trials that were published right before this review paper from Dr. Kung was released earlier this year. You can see that for every single trial, start digestibility increase over time as fermentation progresses. I also like to highlight, however, that early on, the increase in fermentation is greater, and then those samples start reaching a plateau. Okay? So my suggestion for you is, very likely, the cutting point for that increase is right here, around 90 to 120 days of fermentation. Okay? I'm not showing all the data, but research supports the use of inventory. So if you can store your crop for 90 to 120 days before opening to improve start digestibility, it may be a very good tool. However, I didn't show those slides today, but we have data that show that ensiling time does not attenuate for differences in hybrids or maturity. Okay? However, it does increase digestibility regardless of the hybrid and regardless of the maturity. So it could be used as a tool in order to use the more digestible hybrid or less mature plants first, open the second silo later, and you have a constant start digestibility. And last, it requires proper management. If you're storing material for longer, it means that you need to do a better job packing and sealing so you can make sure nothing is gonna create any problems with that. Okay? That's all I had for you today. Okay? I heard that our football team will start milking now because we couldn't get your coach. Okay? You have my email on the corner here. If you have questions we don't have time to answer today, please send me an email. I will be glad to answer your questions. Okay? For the records, and that's something people give me a very hard time in Florida, I'm a Badgers fan. Okay? So thank you.
Thank you. We got time. couple questions. Okay, I think we've got time for a couple of questions. Who has a question right here?
So at the beginning, you said the higher prolamine was bad. I thought over the years we've seen that that's true in dry grain, but not necessarily in corn silage. That after fermentation, it does negate that.
Luis, please repeat
Absolutely.
the question.
So the question was about the effect of prolamine and if this particular indicator is more important to dry corn rather than corn silage, because since we just discussed, bacteria in the silo have the power to produce proteases that break down those prolamines, okay? I do think it's more important to dry corn. I have no doubts on that, but I still think there is difference between hybrids. I think the prolamine assay is not very good. I also think the Starch digestibility assays are not very good. Okay, but I think there is still some difference. If I had to rank, obviously it's much more important to dry corn than high moisture corn, and for high moisture corn is more important than to corn silage. Okay, but I think we still need to pay attention because at least from a research perspective, we need to keep going through all those different gaps in order to improve digestibility. But absolutely, for dry corn is way more important.
Yes, right here.
On the comments you had regarding the comparative processing digestibility, was any of that shredlage aspects, or was it conventional processors?
So the question was, the study we have about processing, summarizing data versus maturity, if any of those was performed with shredlage versus conventional processors. All that literature was with conventional processors, okay? We tested shredlage. Shredlage was more effective in both of the studies we participated compared to a conventional processor in terms of kernel breakage and starch digestibility, okay? I'm unaware of any data with very mature corn silage versus shredlage. However, I saw samples in the field, and this is an observation, it's not data, okay? There are a lot of times that shredlage cannot break those hard kernels neither, okay? And another thing I would like to highlight is even when using shredlage, you still need to go there, pay attention to everything that's going on, and make sure kernels are broken, okay? By the way, the shredlage company have in their website guidelines to harvest based on maturity. So the drier the silage is, more aggressive they suggest you are, which means lower theoretical length of cut and tighter gap between rows. Okay, they have that on their website. They had that for many years, and this started because when we first ran our trial, we suggested that perhaps shredlage could be a good tool to harvest drier material. Some people did that in the field and it was not good.
Okay. I think we, in order to keep on time, we need to keep moving. Let's thank Luis for a good presentation.